place called Midsummer Norton, which was a small mining community still. And just along the road, my mates went to a Venture Scout unit and they dragged me along. And I was taking caving, climbing. And that winter, I was brought up here to Snowdonia. The leadership wasn't terribly competent. But I can remember driving across or being driven across the moors at Cerrig-y-Drudion, the A5, and seeing the mountains of Snowdonia ahead of me. I'd never seen a mountain before. I'd never been out in the south of England or out of the West Country. And that 3 days in the Welsh mountains changed my life. From then on, outdoors was, there was a legitimate way to use that energy in that adventure. And one of the things I will put down right at the start, it will not be true of everything you do. It will not be true of every expedition you run. But certainly when you're working with young people and occasionally with adults, what we do will change lives. Now, sometimes that will be deliberate because you're doing the expeditions as part of a school system or a social system of some form. But without any more thought on it, we will inspire people, change lives, make them rethink. So I think there's that in the background. In my own case, 16 years old, I'm taken to the mountains, just blew my mind. And for many years, I was a mountaineer, became MIC, got me ML, mountain leader, back in 1974, which I would imagine is before some of you were born, which makes me old. And I've worked at a particular period of my life. I worked a lot on ice in Scotland. I've worked on the MIA at Placid Brennan as an assessor and as a trainer, but that's all behind me now. In my 30s, I got dragged out paddling, mainly whitewater kayaking and sea kayaking. Really, they became great things. And sea kayaking, a lot of solo sea kayaking, because on a day off, I could throw the boat on the roof and just go sea kayaking. And some really bloody outrageous things. Biggest seas I've ever been in as a sea kayaker were always solo. Epic tales to tell there somewhere. And then gradually, so in my late 30s, coming up 40, and I've paddled in Nepal, I've climbed ice routes on Kilimanjaro, on Mount Kenya, I've climbed in the States. Well, the first thing was, I always like objectives, so I've paddled the Grand Canyon of Colorado, organised that. And then I was taken canoeing. So I met my Lol Collins, and he was good, but we were also outrageous because we were paddling hard stuff in kayaks, so the water in the canoe didn't bother me. And coming to the canoe felt like coming home, because one of the big strings through my life has been to expedition, the journey. And so I got into the canoe. So big things, well, I've guided the Grand Canyon of the Colorado in kayak, done 2 trips. The second one, I was a guide down there. I paddled in Nepal. I've done massive sea kayak guiding, mainly on the west coast of Scotland, lots of circumnavigation, 7-8 day trips, lots of canoe stuff. And now I regularly work in Canada. This will probably be the first year in a long time I'm not in Canada. So everything I'm talking about is from experience, both as on a personal level, what I do as an individual and my love of expedition and in the outdoors. And then the second one is a very practical experience of guiding everything from young people on expeditions in France, in Scandinavia, through to adults on 14-day trips in Canada. So everything is based there on experience. So going through some ideas, and I've jotted down very quickly. One of the things is, before you even get going on a trip, in my mind, I like to work out the ethos. So if I'm doing it with mates, then what are we actually doing? What sort of style are we doing? Are we going hell for leather? Are we out to just slow it down? Are we going to push hard? A guy called Rob Eaglestaff, who did the first circumnavigation of Wales in canoe, that'd be round about 92. Wasn't better till Colin Skeeth went around Britain 2 years ago. And he talked about Eskimo time. If the going's good, you go. So we would push really hard on that trip. We were taking 2 tides a day. If the conditions were good, we just pushed. On the other hand, if the conditions were bad, we sat it out. We worked, as he called it, on Eskimo time. That was our ethos. Both of us were into that, and that drove both of us. The problem is if you're on a trip and you have different ideas of the ethos of the trip, and that can be with mates or it could be with customers. If you haven't got that agreed to start with, then that causes tensions as people get tired. When you are a provider like myself, working largely nowadays in Canada with Frontier Bushcraft, our ethos is that the customers are very much part of the expedition. We're not there to do the catering. We all take turns with stuff like that. We involve them in the decision making. And this year I should have been on the Porcupine River in Saskatchewan, and neither Paul or I know it. Now, a lot of guides go to places they know. But one of the things that we were selling to our customers, part of our ethos, our background to all of this, is that you can actually see us being involved in decision making for real. This isn't a river where we're making the same decision for the 50th time, but this is a river where we don't know, other than the guidebook, what's around the corner. We don't know where the portage starts. You're going to be involved in that decision making. Now, that's all well and good, and most times that works extremely well. Occasionally, customers don't, they get there, they've fallen in love with the idea, but actually when they get there with tiredness and whatever, they want the decisions made for them. And it's trying to balance that ethos out. If you're working with young people, then again, how much is their decisions, you know, you're backing off on DV expeditions and trying to get that balance where, you know, they feel they're making decisions, which to them is probably the most important thing. They're making real decisions. Going down through my notes, the other one I was going to throw out at the moment is plans and having a flexibility in plans. So I think a classic example of this is circumnavigations in sea kayaking. So, you know, I've guided around Islay several times, Mull 5 or 6 times I've guided, been to the Outer Hebrides, and I always have, so Islay is a classic. Well, Mull is as well, because Mull's easier because it's relatively cheap to take a vehicle on. And I've said to customers before now, when the weather's been poor, we'll take vehicles onto the island and we will choose our start point to suit the weather conditions. We don't have to say we start it open. We don't have to say we start there. Pay a bit of extra money. There's our start point to suit the weather. And you have to have a flexibility in this. I was with a trip with some Dutch sea kayakers. I was guiding Islay, and it's a big trip. The headlands on the west side of the island, the Mull of O or the Rins, they get 8-knot currents, and there's no shelter from the Atlantic, so they can take swell. So those were a critical part of that trip. But the weather wasn't good, so I said, well, we're not going to cross from the mainland. We're not going to do the crossing. We'll take the ferry. But on the ferry, before we got there, I'd said, right, well, we're going to go around. I'd looked at the weather conditions. I said, we're going to go anti-clockwise. But when I was on the ferry, I got another forecast and I saw there was a window of opportunity that I could get around the Mull of O and the Rins in the first couple of days. So I've given them the plan, but I've retained the flexibility, and I pull them up and say, sorry, folks, plans change. When we get off of here, we're going clockwise. Here's the window of opportunity. So you have to sell them the idea and why you're doing it. Sometimes you can involve them in the decision making, but this was one really on me. And I went, there is a window of opportunity. I'm going to take that opportunity to go round there. And that works. So again, the Great Glen, the number of people go up, and I don't like it being called the Caledonian Canal. I bloody hate that. So if you've got questions, of course, about the Caledonian Canal, don't ask me. If you've got questions about the Great Glen, again, that's a psychological one, because you call it the Caledonian Canal, you imply something. You call it the Great Glen, it changes the thinking in somebody's head, because you've got Loch Ness, you've got Loch Lochy, huge bodies of water, and I think you demean it by calling it a canal, but I also think you demean it in people's heads psychologically, and they don't make as good a decisions. But anyway, my biggest piece of advice, somebody going up to the Great Glen, check your weather forecast. And I know people that have looked at the forecast and gone, we'll go east to west or northeast to southwest, rather than go the classic Fort William to Inverness. So if you can have flexibility in your plan, but that isn't always possible. So in Canada, for instance, we get very often dropped in by float plane. The pickup is at another point. The flexibility there comes in creating time. One, in your initial plan. So we had a problem when we were looking at this initially, in that we looked at, well, people like to have 2 weeks holiday. So they fly out one weekend, one day. But we looked at some of the trips we're doing and went, do you know what? That gives us no slack. We have to tell them the trip. So people are flying out of the UK on the Friday, 2 complete work weeks, probably coming back in on the Monday. So that interferes with how people normally plan holidays. But what that does is gives us some extra time. Then early on the trip, if there is easy conditions, then we'll move a little bit further than we need, but then we can build in rest days. But again, you've got to tell people to be prepared for that. So there, on these longer trips, the flexibility is creating some spare time. So if you get really bad conditions, you can sit it out without pressure. And I've had the error in the past of slotting a trip in between 2 major paying bits of work. And so we said, can you do this? Can you do this in Canada? And on the trip itself, and I was guiding, I was under immense pressure. I had no slack in the system. We lost a day at the start because the weather was poor, the float plane couldn't go in. So we've lost a day on a tight trip. And from ever onwards on that trip until really 2 days from the end, I was under immense psychological pressure. And it was pressure for the clients because they wanted to do lots of fishing and lazing around, but there was no time for that. So building flexibility into plans is really, really important. And that can be in the big picture, the direction round saying, it can be in the building slack into the system, and it's also working with the conditions. And I love sea kayaking because you work with the tides. And you know, I've loved turning around to clients and say, oh, well, the tide's not right, weather's not right, we'll go at 12 o'clock today. We'll have a lazy morning, and then it works. Equally well, I said, we're going to be on the water and paddling at 7 in the morning. Best people for that being the Dutch, because they're there 20 to 7, they're sitting in the boats on the water waiting for me, and we're off. And again, it's getting people into, I loved sea kayaking for that. I went to the Summer Isles, and it's in the Summer Isles are beautiful, really nice sea kayaking, but there is no tidal stream. So I could get on the water at 9, I could get off the water at 4. It bored me silly. I love the scenery, but it wasn't what sea kayaking was to me. I love the fact that the sea imposes its timing on me, and I get out of this 9 to 5 existence of normal life. Equally well in terms of conditions, both in Canada, but a classic one, a friend of mine had to take over a trip from me in Scotland because I was completing something else. And he came back and he really, really moaned. He said, it was terrible. The weather was terrible. He said, every morning we get up, it was calm, it was muggy, and the midges just ate us alive. And then we'd get on the water and the wind would be in our faces all day. And we'd get off the water and it'd go calm again and the midges would eat us again. And I just looked at him and I said, well, why didn't you get on the water at 7 in the morning? And when the wind picked up, you know, quick snap, get on the water, do some paddling, and then get off the water when it was windy. And he just looked at me because he could not step out aside. I know him. He would have been on the water at 11, not at 9. But he couldn't step out a 9 to 5 existence. And that really, so having flexibility and selling that flexibility to people, you know, work with the conditions. So I'll keep going with my thoughts at the moment. The other one that I've really found, there's a physical side of it, you know, and I know customers who, because we make sure they understand the physicality of it. I know one guy who's struggled in recent years. He's booked himself onto the Porcupine trip. We've cancelled it for this year. We've bumped it into next year, but he's been going to the gym. He just knew he needed to be fitter than he was. He's a great guy. Come the portages, he's slow, but he's methodical, he's careful, but he just knew he needed to be fitter. So we're selling that side of it. But the physical side also hits into the psychology, because a lot of modern people are not used to aches and pains, particularly as we get older, unless you're involved in a lot of physical activity. And that hits into the psychology of a trip, and there's a whole series of things with this. And the longest trip I've guided was a circumnavigation of Wales 10 years ago. We did 440 miles on the sea and 200 miles on the inland in canoe. And one of the lads that I was guiding had never done a trip longer than 3 days, 2 nights out. And now suddenly we're on it turned out to be a 25-day trip. We're going on the water every day when the conditions are there. And he's getting aches and pains. Now, I'm getting aches and pains. I'm getting a few sore spots. I hadn't done the training I'd wanted because Lena was pregnant with Maya. The agreement was I could still do the trip as long as there was no big problem. My daughter was born 7 weeks before the trip. So I hadn't had the time. We'd had a difficult pregnancy. I hadn't had the time to go and train. So that was difficult. I was getting aches, pains, sores. I got something wrong in clothing wise, bloody got a sore on my testicle. Nobody offered to put the cream on for me. No, it was wet kit, bloody wading up a tidal estuary because it was just not coming in fast enough. Not good. But I know from long experience, psychologically, it is going to get better. The aches and pains are going to get better. Generally, I'm getting old now, I'm in my late 60s. The aches and pains don't disappear as quickly. But this lad didn't know this. You know, he's getting aches and pains, and what he is seeing is another 24 days, 20 days stretching in front of him. And so there's a psychological side of this, that this is normal. But they don't understand that, and you've got to get through that. I've had other people that, you know, you're going into the wilderness in Canada and you go in by float plane, and people, the excitement of all this, and one of the things I try to prepare people for is once you could get in there, there's a moment the float plane takes off. Generally, most of the pilots come and do a fly pass once they've taken off, and then they're gone. And there's a profound silence. And I like to look around at people's faces, and I warn them, because again, there's a psychological element to this. There's this profound, I've now got 14 days paddling in front of me in a wilderness context. So getting them to understand that. But also the end of a trip, you know, you've 14 days in this tight little group. Sometimes you're just glad to get out of there. It's been wet, it's been hard. But there is also a psychological element to finishing a trip. When you've been in this bubble of existence and away from the world. Mine, Colin Skeeth, I warned him, he's the guy who went around Britain. I warned him after this trip, because you're so focused on driving day on day. I warned him and he didn't believe me, and he mentions it in his book that he didn't believe me. And he got hit psychologically afterwards. It's like a form of depression. You've lost your purpose in life. So there's all sorts of impacts once you get into the much bigger thing with that. The other side of it is, in terms of the safety, it's a psychological, getting people to understand if they're in wilderness, it's a different thing in Britain. It's not great getting injuries in Britain, and on some of the Western Sea locks and some of the places in Scotland, it's not always easy. But I had somebody break a wrist on a Hebridean island, phoned up and had a chat to the Coast Guard. I could have got them out there. I offered to get them out there. It was calm sea. I could have towed them to the nearest place with road access. They were unhappy, so I'm not going to push that in that context. Spoke to the Coast Guard. They phoned me back and they said, helicopter be with you in 10 minutes. There was one on exercise. So from breaking a wrist to being flown out of there was less than an hour. Now, Canadian wilderness, bad weather, you know, that's a different ballgame. We've had somebody dislocate a finger and then decide they would continue with the trip because it popped back in. We strapped it, but it turned out they'd broken it. But if you get a serious injury, a cut with an axe or a saw, and generally we try to discourage, particularly we get a lot of people who are bushcraft orientated. They like the saws and axes. And if I go back to the days, go back 20, 30 years ago when I was guiding a lot of canoeing on the west coast of Scotland, I learned one thing. I didn't take an axe. An axe was a man thing. Most bloody men, or there's certain men, you give them an axe. They live in a house with central heating. They live in a flat. They haven't touched an axe, but they seem to think it's one of the things that a man can do is pick up an axe. And even if you know what you're doing, an axe is a dangerous thing. So generally in Canada, it's explained to people you have to rein it in. You're in a different context. in terms of using your knife, using your saw, using your axe, walking down the riverbank, carrying down. And, you know, you'll see lots of footage of me customers carrying a boat on their own across a portage. But you also see customers carrying between two of them on their shoulders, because on the shoulders is the only way you're going to get across a portage. And it's got to be done safely. And we're not imposed, you must do it this way. Here's a couple of methods, what suits you. But there'll be places you'll see us going down a steep area where we're carrying a boat between two of us in the hands, and we even put ropes down because we cannot afford the injury. And it's understanding injuries are bad in the British context, in the wilderness context even more so. And giving people roles within the thing, because people can feel lost, particularly if they're around a lot of skilled people. And they're motivated and they feel lost. And I remember on one trip, this guy, you could see he jumped on the trip at the last moment. It was a personal trip. I'm still the person making decisions. And he felt, what am I contributing to the team? And in those days, I always liked to be up first, get a fire going, get the coffee going. But he got up before me one morning and he took on the role that he would be the first up. And I just knew to back off and let him have that job for himself. He felt he was contributing. He lit the fire, he got the brew going, he gave people shout. Nowadays, I love that anyway, because I tried to train people that I get up after you've brought me my first big mug of tea. So you see pictures of the tea being thrust in under the tent. Food, yeah, trying to remove rub points on trips. On personal trips, I've had a couple what I call hunger trips. You just can't eat enough. You can't carry enough food, so you actually get really hungry. We did a self-supported, Franco Ferrero himself did a self-supported trip down the Tambacozy, which is a class 5 river in Nepal. That drops into the Suncozy. That time of year, there's not many raft trips, so we did the rest of the Suncozy unsupported. We couldn't carry enough food. We hoped to buy stuff from villages, but it's not a main tourist patch, so the food was pretty crap. We couldn't get any fats or anything like that. By the end, we were starving. It was in January. And little things like we had 2 equal plates. Whoever cooked doled the food out. The other person chose which plate they had. So there was a real incentive. We had a single Mars bar that Franco got out, but it was all twisted and warped. And it was like watching a diamond cutter at work as he measured this thing up to cut it in half. And then I got to choose which half I had. It removed one of the real rub points on an expedition. And we're very careful on that sort of stuff on trips because, you know, it doesn't matter how good you are, we all get tired. Removing rub points is important. And then the last issue I'm going to do before opening up for questions, the importance of dry kit and good kit. And with Canada, we send out exhaustive kit lists to customers. But we found that sometimes they damn well ignore them because they know better. And we had somebody who had the most amazing waterproofs, Swazi stuff from New Zealand, really expensive, top quality. He got all the lists and he had fleeces. What we didn't know, because it was more comfortable, he was wearing t-shirts under it. And on this particular day, he was my bound paddler. It was shit. It was cold. It was wind out the north, which in Canada, if you get rain with that, it's pretty bitter and awful. And he had a t-shirt underneath, which got sodden, and it was a bitter day. And he got to the portage. It was obvious he was becoming hypothermic. So we got changed his top layer of clothing. It wasn't a great place to camp. Paul and myself made a decision. We would push hard to the next campsite, which was about an hour and a bit away. And I was taking no prisoners. Once I got him in the boat, he was still able to paddle. I wasn't waiting for anybody. It was easy paddling. I was just going to push hard. Got into the campsite. And I think it's probably the only time we've ever got a stove going on it. But it was like the group were tremendous. The tarp was up, firewood was being collected, a stove was on to get a brew into the guy, help with getting his tent. Everything was right as rain. But we relied on customers to do things. And do before a trip like that, do you say, right, show me this, show me that? And we're getting to the stage. We've had it with waterproofs, people's waterproofs aren't good enough quality. It's trying to get through to people. So you are reliant. And things like sleeping bags being double bags, as I say to people, if you take a swim and your kit's wet and it's pouring with rain and it's shit weather, if you get into camp, you can get your tent up and you've got a dry sleeping bag, you've got dry underwear, you've got dry socks, and you've got a dry shirt, you're good. But if water gets into that, you've got a real problem. And I've seen somebody do that who should have known better. And again, we were trying to dry a sleeping bag out. It wasn't too bad. In poor weather, by a fire, trying to dry it out, and he did manage because it wasn't sodden. It was a minor mistake. It was still an error. It wasn't double bagged. He thought his bags were good enough. They were good quality, but it's critical. But psychologically, he got hit because he felt he should know better and that he'd showed himself up. And it was interesting over the next 3 or 4 days, and it took him that to recover psychologically, I would say. So all the time, there's all these planning things. There's this flexibility in planning. It's creating time. But there's also a massive, I would say, a massive psychological element to everything we do in this game, both for us as leaders and for the clients. So there you go. There's my spiel. So I am now open for questions. So that's over to you, Dave, to manage that.
Okay, brilliant. If you've got a question, I think if you look along the toolbar, there's a reactions thing, so you can put your hand up. So if you chuck your hand up, if you want to ask a question, I'll introduce you to ask your question. Put your thing down, ask your question, and then I'll bring the next one in. Everybody okay with that?
No,
yes, David.
My phone from there so I can see timings.
Okay. Who's got a question? Come on. Don't let me down.
I'm totally overwhelmed with the amount of...
Alan, I'm sure you've got a question there.
Oh, and Mike,
I'll do you a question if you want then, Dave. Yeah,
thank you.
One second. So Maya is 7 years old.
No, 10.
No, when you were 7, she did a 10-day wilderness trip in Algonquin. Now, lots of families go out and do really adventurous things. Bit different when you've got young kids out in the wilderness. And again, fantastic to see the changes in play as the time goes, but also trying to get through to them that you can't get yourself hurt out here. This isn't good. So there you go, Maya. So, hi, sorry, who am I speaking to?
Alan, here. This one in the top in the middle with the Cuillin Sound behind me.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, Ray, really liked some of the stuff you say, trying to get clients more involved in taking responsibility in decisions and helping them develop personally when you're on trips. Do you have any special tricks that you use in terms of trying to help them? My experience is that, it's so easy, especially when you've got quite strong leadership and guides, for people just to regress back to being the customer. And I accept that obviously giving them responsibility for roles and for tasks and stuff can be one of the mechanisms. Are there any other special experiences that you have to make that work?
Well, I'm going to go. Well, before we even get going, I love the C chart behind you. Cuillin Sound, I just love. I think it's bloody fantastic.
Yeah.
I've been through that so many times, and at the easternmost point, where it goes round the corner, or not where it goes round the corner at the bottom, there's that reef that comes out. And there's sometimes little play wave there, and it's a no pressure environment. I do love that. So thank you. Yeah, I like that behind you. So how do you get them involved? First thing is, what have they bought into? Because sometimes actually what they want is to be looked after. And if that's the case, you ain't gonna, you and I can play at giving them some of the decision making and the like, and they happily do that when there is no pressure. But so often when they get tired or whatever, they're going to go on ours. And sometimes we give them the appearance of decision making.
Sure. And
sometimes they don't want it anyway. And I've had that in Canada. People really, they wanted to be in that environment. They wanted to be looked after. They wanted to be, briefings in the morning and whatever. And I think that's so individual, particularly with adults. What do you want from this is a big question. If they want to be involved in the decision making, it's allowing them that, I think. But again, with that overview of it, because where do I go with this? Basically, you've asked me, I think, a very difficult question. And I think the main thing is to have it as a question in our heads.
Yeah.
And it's like with my Dutch sea kayakers, they were really experienced, but they liked, and I only gave that up 2 years ago. I wasn't spending enough time in a sea kayak, so I wasn't fit enough really to feel comfortable working with them. And one of them turned around to me, and I always involved them at the start of the day. They would expect a briefing. I would go through the options. And after I'd finished with them, they actually invited me and my family to the Netherlands. They flew us over. They looked after us. They had us give a talk. It was fantastic. They wanted to say goodbye. And one of the people said, "Thing about you, Ray, you always gave us choices, but we always knew which one you wanted us to take."
Yeah.
Now, that was
options, but not.
Yeah. And it depends. Can we give? How much can we give them? I saw there's a guy, Jeff. I'm just trying to. He works for an American university, being a really top climber. He's climbing Yosemite or whatever, and he does a month-long trip on the Mississauga River on a section we do in 13, 14 days. But what they're doing is lots of study and whatever. And he truly gives the decision-making to the group.
Right.
But that slows everything down. He allows them to decide, are we going to run this, portage this? Are we going to do this, do that? And for the young, so it's having that, he just does it brilliantly. A lot of time and respect for him. Even down to, there's a portage over into Brunswick Lake, which we tell customers we're going to do. We tell them why we're going to do it, because Brunswick Lake is stunning. He gives his group a choice. They look at the size of it, 1.5 kilometers, and they choose not to do it. It's a hard portage, but it's a historic one. It's what the old Hudson Bay Company did, because their post was on Brunswick Lake, so they had resources to feed people through the winter rather than on the river. So it's deciding what level, it's what they want, and is it appropriate, and when do we have to override it? And the other problem with that is sometimes their decision making they can make knowing we can always override it.
Yeah.
And you're quite right. There's this thing, they get into a mental ethos of, I remember this ice climbing. Somebody who'd always been nervous as somebody I took climbing on rock or whatever, really nervous personality. And I ended up taking them up an ice route in Cairnsnechta in the Cairngorm. And part way up, it was meant to be a grade 2-3. It was certainly grade 3-4. It was difficult conditions. That wasn't a problem. I was expecting it. But then the wind changed direction and I couldn't see. And I put my hand on my glasses and I couldn't reach my glasses. There was a thick layer of ice on them, Verglas. And it was super cold water hitting the cliff, firing up the cliff. And as soon as it touched you, it turned to armor plate. The rope turned into a rod rather than a rope. I couldn't put it through a belay plate, whatever. And everything is from then on is sketchy. Speed is the essence now. My belays were shoddy, but I just had to move it. I got into the top. We folded the rope and folded it on top of a rucksack. Anyway, in the pub that night, I said to him, I was really impressed with you today when it got difficult. I said, you were so calm and relaxed, which was something he normally wasn't. He said, yeah, it was all right, Ray. I knew I was with you. And I went, oh, shit. Sometimes customers believe they're safe because they're with us.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is a misplaced thing. So how do you do it? I don't know. After all these years, involve them as much as possible, allow them to make the decisions that are appropriate, and work from there. So there you go. That is a difficult question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Craig, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, we're always learning, and we will always continue to learn as coaches, as people, as guides, or whatever we choose to be. But from a expedition leadership point of view, was there, and there've probably been many, but is there one particular turning point that stands out to you, and how did it affect you?
I would say there've been a lot of turning points on. So this is not cheating, but I go back to the last answer. the realization that customers can have a false idea of their safety because they were with me or with a guide, that they still treated it like Alton Towers. They were being looked after. They were safe because they were with Ray Goodwin, they were with Dave Janes, they were with somebody. And that was that feeling of perfect safety. So that's one realization. And I would go to that ice climb as that was a moment in time, and there's a lot of moments. The other one that I would do is the first time I attempted to sea kayak in Scotland. I knew the island of Skye. As a climber, I've done the Coolin Ridge and stuff like that, done masses of time on the Coolin, loved it to bits. So first time going to Scotland, I don't know an awful lot. A friend and I went up, we'll go around Skye. Well, one, it was too big a trip. We took no account of the weather direction. We had a plan, and it sort of two and a half days in, it was very obvious that that plan would not work. And I don't think any time after that on the water, I ever acted like that. I would go up. If, you know, there's sometimes, Billy Boy, hey, dog's having a growl here. It wasn't the question. So where I could do, so that trip would have been far better if I'd driven onto the Isle of Skye and chosen a point up in the north end of the island to actually work with the weather rather than stick to a plan. So that again, I think is a real sort of moment of realization. It's like if I could go back to my alpine climbing days, I now know that one, I needed a lot more time. I never had flexibility. I only had relatively short holidays. But I always had a plan. I'd go to Chamonix, and the weather's shit in Chamonix. I should have gone to the Maritime Alps or something, gone somewhere different. So maintaining flexibility and not getting locked into a plan. So you can go on my YouTube channel and have a look. And there's Colin Skeeth and I did a circumnavigation of Mull in canoe. It was partially a present to me because my Dutch clients, I'd given up with the sea kayaking. Mull had always been a favourite guided trip for me. And so I wanted to go around in canoe. I know it pretty well. I know how badly it can kick off. Colin obviously is a phenomenal paddler in canoe and on the sea. But the agreement was, the flexibility was, if the weather's bad, well, one, we can start anywhere we like, so we have that as flexibility. We put 8 days aside, so that gives us flexibility in time. And the other flexibility, if the weather's poor, I ain't even bothering to drive to Scotland. So that trip on Skye, I think, was a real thing about it, is I've thought afterwards. And again, this modern terminology, being a reflective practitioner is what we've always done. If you're good at something, you think about what you've done. So I think that Skye, so the ice climb for realizing that clients can be in a bubble in their own head, and this trip on Skye in that not taking account of conditions and just blindly going ahead with something that had inspired me. So there you go, some thought there.
Thank you, Ray. Anybody else got a question? I'm sure you have. Okay.
Somebody else coming up for a question?
Yes, yeah, Steve Art.
Hello, Ray. Steve from Pembrokeshire here. Just a question really about the planning stage really of the trip. You know, getting your group prepared for the longer trip. So my question is, how important over the years have you found it in getting your group together for possibly a weekend together, assuming that your group could be from one organization only, or could be several individuals or whatever. How important is it to get that group together for a weekend of activities similar to the to the environment that you'll go into? Obviously, in different countries it's going to be different, but what has it made a difference to the trip if you've managed to get that done before?
Right. Well, a lot of situations I live in, I can't do it. We're getting people booking to Canada trips, and sometimes, we try and get a correspondence going. Some people might book a few days coaching with me. Some people would done courses with Frontier Bushcraft, who I work with, sort of with woodland skills. But some people turn up and we have not met them. We have an idea of their background. So that actually is quite a difficult situation, I think. And I think you're quite right. If you can get people together beforehand, you can share a lot of these ideas that I've been talking about with them. You begin to get a slightly different view of them, but you're not going to get a true view until the trip. And there also is the problem that some of the trips we run now in Canada, we have a dedicated following. So when we advertise the Porcupine River, it was filled within, and it's an expensive trip. And people over a year in advance it was booked within, I think, 10 days. Because people that have done other trips with us and known to us are jumping on it. They're going, oh, they haven't done that before. We want to do that. If I'm working with school children, there's obviously, and I don't tend to do that nowadays, but getting them to do things beforehand, there's preparation for it. That might be done via the school. That, I think, is really important. If you can do it, and I think a lot of people do it, if you can have a pre-expedition thing. A lot of the things that we have to explain in writing, and I'm now thinking that, it's great. I was talking to Dave about this, the use of Zoom and all these things, being able to get people together. We do it via Facebook. We have a Facebook group for each trip so people can bounce things onto there and chat things. We have to manage that because some people go off with wild ideas. But yeah, I generally speaking, I would say it is a very good idea to have done stuff beforehand. But in the practical world that I live in, it doesn't seem to work. We find that with the busy schedules of the participants, myself and Paul, find that hard to do.
I must admit, from my perspective, certainly doing some longer sailing trips. It's quite important. If you've got the chance to do it, it's well worth doing. And the longer the trip is, the more worthwhile it is to do that if you can.
Yeah,
we've had a few.
I agree with you.
We've been offshore. You're 4 or 5 days. Into your trip, you're a long way from land, and people's personalities aren't necessarily what you expect them to be, and their skill levels aren't.
But I would say that's also the case if you've met them briefly for a weekend in an easier context. It isn't until 5-6 days, or it gets rougher, it gets harder, or they get tired, that you begin to see other things. So I'm in total agreement with you. I think you find out some things, and I think you find out some valuable things. But as you've just said, and you know yourself, that doesn't necessarily lead you to understand what's going to happen when it gets difficult. Some people will buckle, other people that you've looked at and you've wondered about, you suddenly see they come into their stride. And I've seen that on expedition, people that are physically struggle a bit, but when you get into the campsite, they're the person that's always doing something, for the team, rather than go off and take a photograph. They're making sure the fire's there, that they do the washing up even. And they feel, they're tired. They're tired like everyone else, maybe more tired. But you don't see that true character until things get a little bit harder and a little bit fuller in. But if you can, I'm in agreement with you, if you can program it in, but we're getting people from the Netherlands, we're getting people from the States, joint trips. So it's not a practicality. The issue with that then is, for me, is that we may have a group of people, most of whom know each other from other trips and other activities, and you get 1 or 2 people that come in from the outside. And again, psychological side of that, And one guy, I would count him as a friend, TC, he's ex-para, and he came along on a trip. And he was obviously standing back to start with, to suss out what was going on. Before he totally committed into the group thing. He respected Paul himself, but he had a sustained experience of living in the outdoors, unlike many other people, more than me in many ways, from exercise. But he would stand back. Other people were a little bit more lost than that because he could be self-contained. But there's an interesting thing with him on a later trip, that he's got a back issue and it really went on the trip. So come the portage, kits having to be carried. But he's the sort of character where he still has to do himself. And you've got to give him the room not to push him. And, you know, I remember him trying to pack his gear one morning, he couldn't bend. So it was a slow process, and somebody else really irritated him by trying to mother him. And if he wanted help, he could ask. I went across TC, if you need something, tell me. And he would, but when somebody comes to mother him, and there's all these games going on. But yeah, that I think meeting in advance is good, but you're never going to see your true colours, as you say, till later on. Yeah.
Okay, lovely.
Well,
thank you, Ray. And anybody's got a question? Yep. Okay, Anne. Thank you.
Hi, Ray. What's your favourite trip? I know it's probably a hard one, but do you have a favourite that you've done?
That's really hard, because you know, I love the Spey to bits, and I've done the Spey in so many different ways. I've done it with my daughter. I've done it, the first time I ever did the Spey, I started on the Rannoch Moor, came across Rannoch Moor, down into Loch Rannoch, portage up to Erich, and it's just silly. And I've done the Spey, you know, from Locking. I love the Spey. So just the way I'm talking about it, I go the Spey for one of my favourites, Mull. Anytime I've ever been around Mull, and I've got to look at how I take my daughter there and do bits and pieces. I just love the island of Mull. In Canada, I think it's always the next trip in Canada for me. So the Porcupine, and I was due to be out this year to do the Porcupine, and then going out with Maya to Killarney, and I was so excited. So we kind of do, knowing that my time now is limited, I'll be 68 this year, and you know, how long does the body last on doing this stuff? So my favourite in Canada is very definitely the next trip, always. So there you go on that. That seeing you there sort of brings up another side of things psychologically, is that very often, and I find this with wilderness trips, that women can be, will normally be in a minority, unless you're in a very special team. I think the most we've had out of 8 is 3 women. Very often it can be a single woman on a trip. And it's making sure that there's a balance, because again, with that type of trip, you can always get one bloke that misogynistic, and you have to, you know, that's going to build tension very quickly. And again, it doesn't just apply to women. I've known very strong women, but a lot of women will carry smaller loads on portages. Lena, my partner, is tough as old boots. She can't carry what I can carry. But but I'll get this with blokes as well, but people don't always see this. You know, I had a guy who was an airline pilot, tiny guy, back problems because, you know, turning around, he did long haul. So turning around in his seat constantly to talk to anybody behind him, he'd ended up with back problems. So coming up with strategies so that the carrying side of things aren't an issue, that the people like me really maintain the concept that there is an equality, but we maintain that equality within a trip. That a woman has privacy on the women and girls in particular, but women in general, there's privacy, that we've got a good setup for the toilet and things like that. And these can easily be forgotten. So sorry to bring up a gender thing just because,
it's all right.
but it was something I'd forgotten to put into my notes on this. And you'll understand, you know, I've paddled with women who are world class. I know a woman I've worked with a woman who's been up Everest twice, so I don't have any illusions in my head on this one. So there is that side of things as well. But back to the original question. So thank you for allowing me to rethink on that. Very important, because I've only got one child and she's a daughter, so I want this world to work for her. But the other side of it is, yeah, Spey, love the Spey. The island of Mull, anything on the island of Mull in the UK, and the next trip in Canada, whatever it is. There you go. Does that answer your...
Thanks, Ray.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you, Ray. You can see by the smile on your face that you like those trips. You could see you smiling. Next question. Chris, yep, thank you.
Oh, I'm just going to fire in one thing on the Spey while I'm about it. People very often ask me, where do you camp on the Spey? Where do you advise camp? And I will never tell anybody. I'll give them advice on how they find a campsite on the Spey. I will never tell them where I camp. Part of it is I'm protective of where I do things. But secondly, if I tell you exactly where I camp, people say, that's where Ray camped, it must be good. But that means lots of people start using that spot. You could camp on the same island as me, but you'd be in a totally different spot. So environmentally, I think that's far better. We spread the load out. If we start there's one island in particular that's got a really good campsite in the middle, everybody knows about it. It doesn't fit with what I'm doing in terms of spacing of time normally. But the wear in there and the fire marks in there are quite astonishing. Very different in Canada. You've got to camp where you camp. You know, it's where everybody else is camped. So that's a psychological change when you get there. And thunderboxes on the more popular wilderness areas. But that's a different question. So don't ask me where to camp on the Spey. If people want advice on how to find campsites, great. But I'm going to disguise that as my care for the environment. I spread this out. Once we start saying this, this, and this, we get what happens in Canada. In Canada, it has to happen like that. Those sites have been used for thousands of years, probably because they're on headlands. They catch a bit of wind to get rid of the mosquitoes. It's where you've got gaps between the trees where people camped over the years. So we have to camp in the same spots. Anyway, an aside. Back to the question.
Morning, Ray. Thanks very much for your talk. Brilliant.
What's the backdrop?
It's the Wind River. The Peel watershed up in the Yukon.
Yeah. Well, I've done the bonnet plume.
Oh,
and I'm looking at doing the wind with customers in a few years' time before my body falls totally apart.
Nice, yeah.
Stunning place.
I think all 5 rivers in that watershed are gorgeous, aren't they? Really nice. Yeah. My question is a little bit of a diversion from the guide scheme, if you're willing. But I was interested in your trip with Maya. I've got a very adventurous 5-year-old daughter, and we've been doing sort of overnight trips and things like that. I'd love to build up to doing a multi-day wilderness trip. Would you be willing to sort of share the kind of process of how you build up to that, ideally without putting them off, and so that you kind of know that you can do it within the reasonable bounds of safety while still having a sort of genuine adventurous experience?
Well, that's not a problem at all. If you've done the wind yourself, I presume, and other rivers that way, somewhere like Algonquin, you're laughing.
Mm.
You know, I deliberately went to Algonquin because I hadn't been there, and Algonquin is probably one of the places every paddler should go at some stage. All the campsites are well used, all the portages are well trodden. That's not a bad thing. Have you done a trip in that sort of area where you get thunderboxes on every campsite?
Yes, I haven't been to Algonquin, but it's similar places, yeah.
Which to me is really important. But little things like when there's film of us in Algonquin, I got one of my favourite bits, Maya will be very embarrassed, was her taking me to explain the toilet. We never let the kids go to the toilet. Why? Yes, why? We never let the kids go to the toilet on their own because of bears.
What those bears?
Yeah, we always threatened we'd feed them to the bears if they were naughty. But, you know, as we explained to them, you know, you've travelled in bear country. A bear is an opportunist. They're not normally going to go for somebody like you or me. Little kid, 7 years old, that's not a threat to a bear. Therefore, it's an opportunity. So things like that. What I did, knowing Maya, I knew it's so child dependent. I know friends that have gone and done big 10, 14-day trips at Killarney and whatever, with one child, their child, and they've done it from the word go. They've had the spare money, really adventurous folk, always traveling, and they just saw it as an extension of what they did. Money's never, you know, until recently, money's always been, if I say tight, you know, I couldn't just go to Algonquin, where Maya would enjoy a trip in this country. But I wanted her to get to an age where she would remember it. That was important for me. But that's more a money thing. So, you know, I've seen mates with 2-year-olds doing trips. It doesn't matter if the 2-year-old remembers it or not. They're all enjoying a trip. So that's the first thing. And I knew that Maya would be far better if we went with another family. Now, other people, it's so down to the family. Other people will go, just those, mum and dad, one child. That's it. Whereas I knew that Maya would enjoy it far, far more if she was in a group of kids. And that was fabulous to watch. And we did basically a trip that you and I would probably be able to do. If we were pushing, we would probably do in 4 days without a big problem if the weather was fine. Probably 5 days if we wanted to chill out a bit. And we took 10 days to do the same trip. So one was creating a lot more time. Portages are an issue in places like that because the kids aren't going to carry much. And you can't double portage. You know, if it's short portage, great, kids can stay with you. If it's a long portage, the kids have got to stay at the end. So we always had one lot go across the portage, and then one adult would be staying with all the kids. We're not leaving the kids alone. We're not going to drag them backwards and forwards. And again, in the Algonquin trip, we had, again, the video is on YouTube. We had one day, fortunately, I could see the weather coming in. You know, we didn't have a forecast, but you could see it was a front coming in. It was going to be a biggie. And so we just hunkered down. We ended up having to dig small trenches, gutters around tents. We had the tarps up. The kids just loved it. They were in good kit. And they just thought it was fun. They were playing and splashing around in the wet weather and spilling water out the tarp. So the big thing is for me that to create lots of time and lots of play. And it was interesting to watch the play through the trip. And if you've done things like the wind and other stuff in Canada, I get an impression there. Just get on with it. Get on with it. Get them into that ethos. And we were due to be in Killarney this year. I doubt that we're going to go. It's still a marginal thing, but I can't see it. So that'll have to be put off next year. Shoot up and do the Great Glen or something, which was meant to be done this Easter. Get on with it, I would say. They're better for it. They're better for it. Okay?
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. I realise it's 11 o'clock. Are you all right to just take one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant.
You give me a question, I can waffle on for ages.
No comment. Steve F., I think you've got a question. No, you haven't. Somebody else put their hand up. I'm sure they did. Nobody else got a question? No, I can't. No, I think that's it, Ray. Ray, thanks very much for that. You've really reinforced what we've been talking about for the last 3 days on the module, and a lot of that is about the expectations and managing people's expectations in you, the trip and everything. So that's been really good. Thank you for that. I'd just like to say, thank you very much, and suggest people go and have a look at Ray's YouTube site. Ray wants to get up to the 4K, so please promote it, get other people to do it, so we can booster up Ray's state pension, which he always likes to remind us that he gets. I'd also like to take the opportunity to recommend Ray's courses. His canoe and advanced canoe leader training and assessments are brilliant courses. And I'd also really recommend one of Ray's training courses or something, even if you just wanted to do a refresher. Just because you've had your canoe leader for 10 years, there's no harm in going back and doing a refresher with somebody like Ray, because it will inspire you again and give you loads more learning. So thank you very much, Ray.
This was a With Dave production.